In my video on Bentham's utilitarianism, I went through the key principles and features of his theory of morality. To recap those just briefly, Bentham's utilitarianism is a version of Act Utilitarianism. That is, we ought to consider each action individually in each situation and measure its direct effect on pleasure and pain. Bentham's utilitarianism is also consequentialist, it's maximising and it's impartial, and it measures the pleasure and pain that each action produces using the Hedonic calculus. I'm now going to raise objections to each of these features. So let's start with Act Utilitarianism. As I already said, Act Utilitarianism evaluates actions based on how much pleasure they directly produce in each individual situation. This means there are no absolutes regarding moral actions. Therefore, if lying would produce the most pleasure in a certain situation, then it is the morally right thing to do to lie. And in fact, it would be morally wrong to tell the truth. And this goes for any action at all, breaking a promise, killing someone. If they produce the most pleasure in any individual situation, you are morally obligated to perform these actions in those situations. We may be uncomfortable with this relativism and think that we ought to, say, keep a promise we made to a friend, even if keeping the promise doesn't maximise pleasure. Rule utilitarianism, often associated with John Stuart Mill, seeks to address this criticism. According to rule utilitarianism, what makes an action right is whether it conforms to a rule that if followed would maximise pleasure. This means that we could make a rule that says keep your promises or do not lie, because it may be argued that communities that are honest and keep their promises tend to better maximise pleasure than communities that don't do these things. There are, of course, criticisms of rule utilitarianism. Now, I'll cover these more in a separate video, but briefly, the problem here is that if rules are followed too strictly, they'll fail to maximise pleasure when there are generally good reasons for breaking the rule in order to produce more pleasure. But if we follow the rules too weakly, that is, breaking them often in order to maximise pleasure, then rule utilitarianism basically just sinks back into Act Utilitarianism, and so we have the same problems as before. Consequentialism is an ethical position that says the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined solely by the consequences of the action. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, and therefore any criticism that we could direct at consequentialism also applies to utilitarianism. One problem is that consequentialism and utilitarianism neglects the moral importance of intentions. Other ethical theories, like natural law theory, it places a lot of moral importance on intention. For instance, it's crucial to the doctrine of double effect. See my channel for videos on this. And situation ethics, although it places great significance on the ends justifying the means, it recognises that our motives are important in measuring how much love is associated with the action. See my channel for videos on this. And there are very good reasons as to why we might think that motives and intentions are more significant. So, for instance, if I hit you in the face, right, it makes a moral difference to us whether I hit you on purpose or whether it was an accident. We are much more likely to forgive someone who hit us accidentally than we are who hit us on purpose. However, according to Bentham and other consequentialists, the only thing of more importance is how much pleasure and pain is produced. And so therefore, if it just so happens that we have two cases, right, of this, and the pain produced in both of these instances from being hit accidentally or by being hit on purpose, imagine that the pain produced is exactly the same. To the utilitarian, there would be no way to say that one action is morally worse than the other. This refusal to recognise the intention, to recognise that intention makes a moral difference, seems counterintuitive. Fortunately, utilitarians often have clever ways of accounting for this, despite not really giving intentions moral weight. So this is because it is often the case that actually intention will make a difference to the amount of pleasure and pain being produced. So, for example, a utilitarian, they could reject our counterexample and say, oh, hang on, there's no way that hitting you by accident and hitting you on purpose would produce the same amount of pain as you have suggested. And this is because hitting you on purpose produces associated mental pains or emotional pain along with the physical pain. Learning that I went away to cause you pain, it hurts us mentally, right? It hurts our feelings. So a utilitarian could reject our counterexample as being unrealistic once we factor in these associated pains. However, let's consider a stronger example. I'm going to bring in Kant here and his ethical theory. Now, don't be scared. Kant can sometimes be difficult to understand, but you should have no difficulty understanding what I'm about to say here. So remember, Kant is a deontologist. This is almost the opposite to consequentialism. Deontology is an ethical position that says that the rightness or wrongness is determined within the act itself. So specifically for Kant, he thinks that for an action to be moral, it must come from a good will. This means that you're willing it for its own sake, because the action itself is good. So with that in mind, let's consider two people who give money to charity. They give the same amount to charity, and therefore the pleasure produced is the same in both instances. But imagine one gives because they feel that they have a duty to their fellow human beings to help the cause that they are giving to. That is, they act from a good will. Whilst the second person gives money only because they want to make themselves look good and attractive to other people. Right? Their motive is entirely selfish. Now Kant says, and this is a good point, performing an action as a result of selfishness isn't moral. It's the opposite of moral. You can't be a good person if you're being selfish, regardless of what the consequences happen to be. Therefore, for Kant, only the person acting from the good will is being moral. The utilitarian, however, doesn't make this distinction. They say as long as the consequences are the same in both cases, there's no way you can say that one action is better than the other. But that doesn't seem right. And if we find Kant a bit difficult, as people often do, we can make this criticism without using Kant. So just imagine someone gives to charity because they generally care about other people, right? And compare that with someone who gives to charity because they only care about themselves and how others perceive them. However we phrase the example, there was a moral difference between the two people, right? Which surely a plausible moral theory ought to acknowledge, but which utilitarianism doesn't acknowledge. A utilitarian could defend their position by saying, well, despite the consequences being the same in this individual instance, generally caring about other people is a disposition that will tend to produce better consequences than being selfish. So that is, their compassion will manifest in other situations and in other behaviours, and on the whole produce more pleasure than selfish behaviour. Therefore, although in this specific case there is no moral difference, we still ought to recognise that selfish behaviour is typically non-conducive to maximising pleasure, and that therefore virtuous dispositions like compassion ought to be promoted. See, I said utilitarianism is clever ways of dealing with intention. But what if selfishness is a really strong motive for some people, and such that if they were less selfish, they simply wouldn't be giving money to charity, right? They simply wouldn't be doing it. They simply wouldn't be helping others. Well, if this is the case, the utilitarian may just have to dig in their heels and say, oh, look, okay, only the consequences are morally significant. If it really is the case that selfishness is a strong motive for doing good in people who otherwise wouldn't do good, we ought to be glad that they are selfish, right? And aren't selfless. Maybe other utilitarians could actually still address this and say something like, well, maybe this says this stuff about education, right? There are right and wrong ways to educate people. And if we raised people to care more about others, the benefits would be even bigger than just saying, well, let the selfish people give money to charity. Maybe we should be focusing on education and stuff like that. So there are loads of different ways utilitarians can try and get around this criticism. Bentham demands that we try to maximise pleasure, and in fact, it is only the action that maximises pleasure that is considered morally right. All alternative actions applicable to that moment which don't maximise pleasure are considered morally wrong. The problem with this is that it makes utilitarianism overly demanding. Take an example. Imagine you go to the cinema for a good time. Well, did that action maximise pleasure? Well, the answer seems to be no, right? You didn't maximise pleasure by going to the cinema. The money that you spent on the cinema could have been given to charity. The time you spent going to the cinema could have been used to help others. But this applies to every single moment of our lives, right? Every single moment that we find ourselves in. So utilitarianism implies that all our time and effort should be sacrificed to maximise pleasure, and if we don't do that, we're doing something wrong. But this sets unrealistically high demands upon us. There's an additional problem with the maximisation of pleasure that is more apparent when we consider that we must also be impartial regarding who benefits from our actions. So, to repeat this point, Bentham's utilitarianism implies that we ought to maximise pleasure impartially, and this means promoting sort of the aggregate happiness. This has problematic results, right? Imagine you're in a position, it's going to get a little bit complicated, and not too complicated, but imagine you're in a position where your action will affect 5 people. One of these is in need, they're in poverty, they're generally quite miserable. But the other 4 are wealthy, they're happy, they have a lot less problems. Now we're going to assign random values to happiness now. So imagine you could perform 2 actions, A and B. Action A increases the happiness of the miserable man by 10 happiness points, and the happiness of the other 4 people by just 1 point each, giving a total increase of 14 happiness points. But action B only increases the happiness of Mr. Miserable by 1 point and the happiness of each of the others by 5, giving a total increase of 21 happiness points. Now, Bentham's utilitarianism implies that because we ought to maximise pleasure impartially, we are morally obligated to go with action B. But this option, it completely neglects the fact that Mr. Miserable is a much greater need than the 4 others. So the result is we neglect his happiness in order to increase the happiness of the 4 people who are already happy enough, because it just happens that that's the best option to maximise pleasure overall. Now, one response to this problem comes in the form of a theory called Prioritarianism, a theory that it does away with this strict impartiality. Prioritarianism was proposed by the philosopher Derek Parfit, or at least I think it was. He's the first to really give it a good substantial defence, and it's since been endorsed by some utilitarian philosophers who have put it as a condition of their own utilitarian theory. Say, for example, Brad Hooker, who advocates a modern form of rule utilitarianism, he includes prioritarianism as a principle of his theory. The important part of the word prioritarianism is the beginning, priority. So let's actually explain what it means. The basic idea of prioritarianism is that we ought to prioritise the needs of those who are worst off. As a result, prioritarianism could favour action B because it puts greater importance on increasing the happiness of the person who needs it most. And we can, of course, criticise prioritarianism. For instance, there were difficulties surrounding how much priority are we expected to give the worst off? How do we balance helping the worst off with increasing, happiness overall? How are we supposed to balance this? Brad Hooker, when he talks about this, and says we ought to give some priority to worst off, he's a bit ambiguous and vague about how we're supposed to measure this. He leaves that a bit unresolved. So finally, let's talk about the hedonic or the philosophic calculus. There's problems with practicality here. One can't help but wonder how practical it is to use the hedonic calculus in order to work out which action, out of all possible actions that one could perform in a situation under consideration, which would produce the most pleasure. Firstly, there's time constraints. One simply wouldn't have the time to work this out for every action, right? You simply have other things to do in your life. Or you may have to make a quick decision, and the moral situation simply doesn't give you the time to contemplate it to the degree that the hedonic calculus requires. Another interesting point here is sometimes making a quick decision, you really have to. A car is on a train track, has broken down, a train could be coming at any moment. If you... a quick decision to save them might be the one that maximises utility here. You actually thinking, oh, well, hang on here, let me just apply the hedonic calculus and think about the intensity, the duration, the certainty. And going through all of that is just wasting precious moments. It really isn't thinking about the hedonic calculus surely isn't going to maximize utility in this situation. A quick decision is actually going to be the thing to do. That's a really interesting thing. Sometimes maximizing pleasure is not doing the hedonic calculus at all. It's actually an interesting way to think about that. But it might be appropriate to apply the hedonic calculus to big choices, such as, should I have an abortion or euthanasia? Questions like that, they already require a lot of time to think about. So that might guide, the hedonic calculus could guide our thought process better there. And in fact, Bentham kind of admits this himself. He says that you're not going to be able to use this all the time, but, if you apply it the best you can, where and when you can, that is that. It's an ideal method that we should try and do, but we can't always do it. But when we can do it, that's better than not doing it. How do we assign values to the intensity of pleasure or the duration of pleasure? How we were supposed to put a numerical value on pleasure, like this pleasure was 5, this is an 8. It seems quite difficult. It also seems rather subjective. And this is another problem, because surely the whole idea is that it's supposed to be an objective measure, because we want to maximise pleasures for as many people as we can with our actions. But how we value individual pleasures may be different person to person. So, playing Call of Duty may give you a more intense pleasure than it does for me. So when we're calculating how much pleasure or pain each person will receive, I might think that if I do this action, you'll get 8 pleasure from that. But actually, you only get 5 because, you like Call of Duty, you don't like FIFA, or you like Call of Duty more than FIFA. Do you know what I mean? I'm deciding what games we should play, and I think, you'll like Call of Duty, that'll give you an 8. But no, you actually like FIFA, that'll give you an 8. Call of Duty is only going to give you a 5 pleasure. So, I know that's maybe not a very difficult moral dilemma, but how we value these things is difficult, it's very subjective. So hopefully those criticisms will give you a few things to think about.